I drove my husband to his very first day of work at my sister's company and found him unloading trucks in the searing July heat. He had just recovered from severe pneumonia, yet there he was, lifting heavy crates by hand, while the company forklift sat perfectly still in the corner. My sister and her husband stood in their glass office laughing at his struggle. When my sister walked down to the dock, she kicked a dirty rag at his boots and smirked at me, telling me that was all he was good for. She had absolutely no idea I was just promoted to senior vice president of the corporation, about to acquire her business. With one single phone call, I could tear her entire empire to the ground. My name is Naomi, and at 34 years old, I learned that blood does not always mean loyalty. Sometimes it just means they know exactly where to insert the knife. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through toxic family members while secretly planning your revenge. You will definitely want to hear how I dismantled my sister's perfect life. It was a blistering Tuesday afternoon in Austin, Texas. The temperature had already hit 100 degrees, and the humidity made the air feel like a thick, suffocating blanket. I pulled my car into the employee parking lot of Apex Logistics. This was the mid-sized freight company my parents handed down to my older sister Vanessa and her husband Jamal. I was there to drop off a hot lunch for my husband Ethan, who was starting his first week on the warehouse floor. Ethan is 35 years old and one of the most brilliant supply chain managers I have ever known. After a brutal wave of corporate layoffs completely wiped out his division, we lost our primary income and our health insurance. To make matters worse, Ethan caught a terrible case of pneumonia that spring and ended up hospitalized. The medical bills drained our savings. Desperate to keep our family afloat, he swallowed his pride and accepted a minimum wage warehouse position at Apex Logistics just to get us back on a health plan. I stepped out of my air-conditioned sedan and the oppressive heat instantly hit my face. I walked toward the loading bays holding the insulated lunch bag. The massive steel doors were rolled up, but the giant industrial fans were turned off. The air inside the warehouse was stagnant and roasting. Then I saw him. Ethan was inside a stifling metal shipping container, manually lifting 50-pound wooden crates and stacking them onto pallets. His gray cotton shirt was soaked through with sweat. He was breathing heavily, stopping every few seconds to wipe his forehead. My heart shattered into a million pieces. He was still recovering his lung capacity. This kind of intense manual labor in this extreme heat was incredibly dangerous. I looked to the left and saw a brand new electric forklift parked idly by the loading ramp. There was no operational reason for Ethan to be doing this by hand. I marched up the concrete ramp, my heels clicking loudly against the floor. As I approached, I heard muffled laughter coming from the upper level. I glanced up at the mezzanine. There, standing inside a soundproof glass office, were Vanessa and Jamal. Jamal is the chief operating officer of Apex, a man who wears $3,000 custom suits to a dirty freight yard and loves to flaunt his authority. He was sipping iced coffee, leaning against the glass and gesturing down at Ethan. Vanessa was standing beside him, throwing her head back in laughter. They were mocking him. They had deliberately ordered him to unload that freight by hand for their own cruel entertainment. I froze as rage boiled up inside my chest. Ethan caught sight of me and tried to straighten his posture to hide his exhaustion. His eyes filled with embarrassment and defeat. He gave me a weak, forced smile that absolutely broke my heart. Before I could speak, the metal door to the staircase swung open. Vanessa and Jamal descended to the warehouse floor. Vanessa strutted over to the loading dock, not bothering to greet me. She looked down at the concrete floor, spotted a grease-stained rag, and callously kicked it right at Ethan's heavy work boots. "You missed a spot over by the oil drums," she said, her voice dripping with venom. She turned to look at me, sweeping her eyes over my work blouse. "That is all he is good for. Keep him working, Naomi, unless you want to starve on your pathetic little receptionist salary." Before I could even form the words to tear my sister apart, the unmistakable crunch of gravel echoed across the loading dock. A pristine silver Mercedes pulled into the reserved parking space right next to the ramp. The doors opened, and out stepped my parents, Richard and Patricia. They were dressed like they were heading to a country club luncheon. My mother wore a crisp linen suit completely untouched by the suffocating Texas heat, while my father adjusted his expensive designer sunglasses. They were here for a surprise visit, a frequent occurrence, whenever they wanted to bask in the glow of their favorite daughter's supposed business empire. They glided up the concrete ramp, completely bypassing the massive shipping container, where my husband was practically gasping for air. Neither of them even glanced in Ethan's direction. Instead, my mother threw her arms open and embraced Vanessa, as if she had just won a Nobel Prize. My father clapped Jamal on the shoulder, laughing loudly at some inside joke. The four of them stood there, a picture-perfect portrait of wealthy arrogance, while Ethan leaned heavily against a wooden crate just 10 feet away, wiping grease and sweat from his face. Then my mother finally turned her attention to me. Her warm, glowing smile vanished instantly, replaced by the deep scowl she reserved exclusively for my presence. She marched over her heels, clicking aggressively against the concrete, and stopped just inches from my face. She looked me up and down, taking in my simple off-the-rack work clothes, and let out a loud theatrical sigh. "Why must you always wear that terrible expression, Naomi?" she demanded, crossing her arms over her chest. "We come here to celebrate your sister closing a major quarter, and you are standing around glaring at everyone like a dark cloud." I looked from her perfectly manicured hands to my husband, whose chest was still heaving from the brutal physical labor. "He is recovering from pneumonia, Mom," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. "And Jamal has him doing heavy manual lifting in a 100-degree warehouse while the forklift is sitting right there." My mother rolled her eyes, completely unfazed by the fact that her son-in-law was being worked to the bone. "Oh, please do not start with your dramatics," she snapped, waving her hand dismissively. "Jamal was gracious enough to give your unemployed husband a broom and a paycheck when nobody else would even look at his resume. You should be down on your knees thanking them. But no, you just have to find a way to make Vanessa look bad." My father chimed in, then not even bothering to lower his voice. "Leave her be, Patricia. Naomi has never been able to handle being second best. It is exhausting." My mother nodded vigorously, stepping even closer to me. Her voice dropped to a vicious hiss meant only for me and Ethan to hear. "Stop being so jealous of your sister's success, Naomi. You have been bitter ever since she got the family trust fund and you got nothing. It is time to grow up and accept your place. Vanessa is a chief executive officer. You answer phones for a living. Be grateful your sister is generous enough to keep a roof over your head." The cruelty of her words hung heavily in the hot, stagnant air. She was referencing the massive trust fund my grandfather had left behind, which my parents had entirely diverted to Vanessa to start this very company, leaving me with absolute zero to pay for my own college tuition. They had spent my entire life financially and emotionally starving me, all while feeding Vanessa's insatiable ego. I heard a heavy shift of work boots behind me. Ethan had stepped forward. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides, his knuckles turning white. Even exhausted, even humiliated, he was ready to step between me and my family. He opened his mouth to defend me, his jaw set with a fierce, protective anger. I reached back and grabbed his wrist. I squeezed it firmly, pulling him back. I turned to look at him. His eyes were completely bloodshot from the heat, lined with dark circles from sleepless nights, worrying about our mounting medical debt. But beneath the exhaustion, I saw the raw, agonizing pain of a man whose pride was being systematically shredded by the people who were supposed to be his family. If he spoke up now, Jamal would fire him on the spot. We would lose the health insurance he had literally bled to secure. More importantly, my family thought I was a helpless receptionist. They thought they held all the power. They had no idea that I held the keys to their impending $25 million corporate buyout. I needed them blind. I needed them arrogant. I needed them to keep digging their own graves. So I swallowed the poison in my throat, forced my face into a mask of total submission, and nodded quietly. I released my grip on Ethan's wrist and handed him the insulated lunch bag. I kept my eyes locked onto his, communicating a silent promise that this would not last forever. I told my mother and father to have a wonderful visit. I wished Vanessa and Jamal continued success with their quarter. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but I delivered them flawlessly. I turned around and began the long walk back across the blazing asphalt toward my sedan. I could feel their eyes burning into my back. I heard Vanessa make a snide comment about my shoes. I heard my father chuckle in agreement. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to march up to that loading dock and verbally tear them to shreds. But I knew better. In the corporate world, you never show your hand when your opponent is busy making a fatal mistake. You let them feel victorious right up until the exact moment the floor drops out from beneath them. I reached my car, unlocked it, and slid into the driver's seat. I slammed the heavy door shut instantly, cutting off the suffocating heat and the sound of their arrogant laughter. I started the engine and blasted the air conditioning. My hands were shaking, gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. But I did not cry. I had shed my last tear over this family a decade ago. Crying was for the powerless, and I was far from powerless. I opened my center console and pulled out my secondary phone, the encrypted line issued only to senior executives at Summit Global Partners. I bypassed the standard contacts and dialed the direct cell number of our lead corporate counsel, a man whose entire career was built on dismantling fraudulent companies during the due diligence phase of mergers and acquisitions. He picked up on the second ring. "Go ahead, Naomi." His crisp voice echoed through the Bluetooth speakers. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy air fill my lungs, shedding the skin of the bullied younger sister and stepping fully into my actual role. "Halt the Apex Logistics acquisition file immediately," I commanded, my voice completely steady. "Put a hard freeze on the $25 million payout." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Are you sure the board was ready to approve the final term sheet this Friday?" "I am positive. The target company is operating under fraudulent pretenses. I want the deep dive audit team deployed tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock. Do not give them a heads up. I want every single operational record completely scrubbed. Pull the warehouse camera footage. Cross-reference their payroll documents against their actual floor schedules. I want every OSHA violation, every instance of wage theft, and every safety protocol breach fully exposed and documented." "Understood." "What exactly are we looking for?" he asked, the sound of keyboard clacking already audible in the background. "Look for severe heat exposure violations. They are deliberately disabling warehouse ventilation and forcing employees to perform heavy manual labor in 100-degree conditions without required equipment or safety breaks. They are doing it to artificially inflate their profit margins before the sale. When you find the discrepancies, flag them for federal compliance." "Consider it done, Naomi. I will have the audit team assemble tonight. They will not know what hit them." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I looked through my windshield, staring at the massive corrugated metal walls of the Apex Logistics warehouse. Inside that building, Vanessa and Jamal were likely still patting themselves on the back, counting the millions they thought were coming their way. My parents had already put a down payment on a second vacation home, leveraging their own house against Vanessa's guaranteed payout. Jamal had been visiting luxury car dealerships all month, test driving vehicles that cost more than Ethan would make in a decade. They had built a massive house of cards on the assumption that a faceless corporate entity was simply going to hand them a blank check. They thought they had broken my husband to assert their dominance. They thought they had put me in my place. But they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. Summit Global Partners was not just another investment firm. We were a massive corporate conglomerate, and I had just been handed the final veto power over their entire industry sector. By trying to humiliate Ethan, they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to legally and financially destroy them. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled out of the parking lot. Let them drink their champagne tonight. Tomorrow morning, the real world was going to kick their front doors down. Later that evening, I pulled up to my parents' sprawling 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. The driveway was already full, forcing me to park on the street. It was a mandatory family dinner, a weekly tradition my mother insisted upon to maintain the illusion of a close-knit, perfect family. I hated these dinners. They were always a thinly veiled excuse for my parents to brag about Vanessa and Jamal, while ignoring my very existence. Tonight, Knowing what I knew about the impending audit, it took every ounce of self-control I possessed to walk through the front door. Ethan had arrived an hour earlier straight from his shift at the warehouse. When I walked into the dining room, he was already seated at the far end of the long oak table looking completely depleted. He had showered, but the exhaustion was etched deeply into the lines around his eyes. He gave me a small nod, and I took the empty seat beside him, placing my hand over his beneath the table. He squeezed my fingers tightly. The dining room was excessively formal, lit by a heavy crystal chandelier. My mother had brought out the fine china and the silver cutlery. At the head of the table sat my father holding court with Vanessa and Jamal seated on either side of him. They were practically vibrating with self-satisfaction. Jamal was dressed in a crisp linen shirt, looking more like he was attending a summer gala than a casual family dinner. "Ah, the prodigal daughter finally graces us with her presence," Vanessa drawled as I sat down. She took a sip of water, smirking over the rim of her glass. "Tough day, answering the phones, Naomi." I ignored the bait, reaching for a bread roll. "Just another Tuesday, Vanessa. How was the warehouse?" Her smirk widened. "Productive. Very productive." Right on cue, Jamal stood up from his chair. He walked over to the antique wooden credenza and lifted a bottle of Dom Perignon. He held it up dramatically, the green glass catching the light from the chandelier. My father clapped his hands together in approval. "Family," Jamal announced, his voice booming through the room. "I think a celebration is in order. As you all know, Apex Logistics has been undergoing final negotiations with Summit Global Partners. Well, I am thrilled to officially announce that they have approved the final term sheet. We are looking at a $25 million buyout by the end of the week." My mother gasped, pressing both hands to her cheeks in exaggerated delight. "Oh, Jamal, Vanessa, that is incredible news." She practically leapt out of her chair to hug them both. My father raised his glass of water in a toast, his chest puffed out with pride. 25 million. I always knew you two would build an empire. Jamal popped the cork with a loud celebratory crack. The champagne bubbled over the rim as he poured generous servings into crystal flutes. He handed a glass to my mother, then my father, and finally Vanessa. He completely bypassed Ethan and me, leaving our water glasses empty. "To the future," Jamal proclaimed, raising his flute. "To Apex Logistics, and to knowing exactly how to play the corporate game." They clinked their glasses together, the sound sharp and grating. I sat perfectly still, my face entirely blank. I knew for a fact that the term sheet had not been approved. My legal team had frozen the file just hours ago. Jamal was celebrating a ghost. He was toasting to a fortune that was currently being locked down by federal compliance lawyers. The irony was so rich I could practically taste it. After the toast, my mother began serving dinner. She placed a massive platter of roasted chicken in the center of the table. As she served, the conversation flowed exclusively between the four of them, detailing exactly how they planned to spend the payout. Vanessa wanted a summer house in the Hamptons. Jamal was eyeing a new yacht. My parents were discussing upgrading their country club membership to the premium tier. Through it all, Ethan remained silent, keeping his eyes focused on his plate. He was doing his best to endure the evening, trying to blend into the background. But Jamal was not satisfied with just bragging. He needed a victim. He needed someone to crush to make his victory feel absolute. Jamal reached into the pocket of his tailored trousers. He pulled out a crisp, brand-new $100 bill. He deliberately crumpled it up in his fist, making a show of ruining the pristine paper. Then he leaned across the table, his eyes locked directly onto Ethan. "Hey, Ethan," Jamal called out, his voice silencing the chatter in the room. Ethan slowly looked up from his dinner plate, his expression guarded. Jamal tossed the crumpled bill across the table. It landed squarely in the center of Ethan's plate, right on top of his roasted chicken. The paper soaked up the gravy instantly. "I forgot to give you your tip earlier," Jamal said, a cruel, mocking grin spreading across his face. "You did an excellent job scrubbing the warehouse toilets today. Really put some elbow grease into it. Take the 100. Buy yourself something nice. Maybe a new pair of work boots. Those ones you were wearing today look like they belong in a dumpster." The room plunged into absolute silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. My parents stared at Jamal, but neither of them said a word to reprimand him. Vanessa just watched with a cold, amused expression, waiting to see how broken Ethan truly was. Ethan slowly reached out his hand, shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the immense effort it took to hold back his anger. He was going to take the money. He was going to swallow this ultimate humiliation just to keep the peace and keep his job. I stood up, my chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Before Ethan's fingers could brush the ruined paper, I reached across his plate and snatched the crumpled $100 bill. It was slick with gravy and warm to the touch. I did not break eye contact with Jamal. I walked slowly around the edge of the large dining table until I was standing directly beside his chair. He looked up at me, the arrogant smirk still plastered across his face, confident that I was just going to hand the money back and apologize for my husband's supposed incompetence. Instead, I held the gravy-soaked bill directly over his crystal flute of expensive champagne. I opened my fingers. The crumpled paper dropped with a soft plop, instantly sinking to the bottom of the glass. The champagne bubbled violently around the greasy bill, ruining the $200 vintage in less than a second. "Keep your money, Jamal," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. "And keep your broom. Ethan will not be returning to the warehouse tomorrow. He is officially done at Apex Logistics." Jamal's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of genuine shock. He stared at his ruined drink, unable to comprehend that I had just openly defied him in front of my parents. Vanessa slammed both her hands down on the table, rattling the fine china. The amusement completely wiped from her face. "Excuse me?" She snapped, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "Who do you think you are talking to? Naomi? Jamal gave your deadbeat husband a chance when nobody else in the city would even look at his resume. You do not get to come into our parents' house and throw tantrums." I turned my attention to my sister, meeting her furious gaze without a flinch. "It was not a chance, Vanessa. It was a power trip. You both used him as a prop to make yourselves feel superior. Ethan is a highly qualified supply chain manager, not a pack mule for you to abuse in a 100-degree warehouse. He is done. We do not need your charity." Vanessa let out a sharp, mocking laugh, but her eyes were burning with pure malice. "You do not need our charity. That is rich. How exactly are you planning to pay his hospital bills, Naomi?" "With your receptionist salary. You are drowning in debt, and we threw you a life preserver." "We will manage," I replied coldly. I turned to walk back to my seat, signaling that the conversation was over. But Vanessa was not finished. She pushed her chair back violently and stood up, pointing a manicured finger directly at Ethan. "If he does not show up for his shift tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., she hissed, "I promise you, Naomi, he will never work in logistics in the entire state of Texas again." I stopped in my tracks and slowly turned back to face her. "Do you think I am bluffing?" Vanessa continued, her voice dripping with venom. "Apex Logistics works with every major freight carrier from Houston to Dallas. I have personal relationships with every regional director. If Ethan walks out on us, I will make one phone call. Just one. I will tell them he is unreliable, insubordinate, and a liability. I will personally blackball him from this industry. He will not even be able to get a job driving a delivery truck." Jamal crossed his arms over his chest, a smug smile returning to his face as he backed up his wife. "She is not joking, Naomi. You know how this industry works. Reputation is everything. You walk away now, and we will make sure his career is permanently dead." The threat was clear, calculated, and utterly vicious. They were not just firing him. They were promising to systematically destroy his entire professional future if we did not submit to their abuse. They wanted us completely broken, financially ruined, and begging for their mercy. I looked at my parents, expecting at least a flicker of hesitation or disapproval at this blatant extortion. But my father simply took a sip of his water, looking bored, and my mother was nodding in agreement with Vanessa. They fully supported the destruction of their son-in-law's career, simply because I had bruised Vanessa's ego. I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. They had just shown me exactly who they were. There was no more room for hesitation. The audit tomorrow was no longer just about exposing bad business practices. It was about total annihilation. My mother slammed her fork down against her china plate, the sharp clatter echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. She stood up so quickly her chair nearly tipped over backward. Her face was flushed with absolute fury, but her anger was entirely directed at me. Naomi, have you completely lost your mind? She shouted, her voice trembling with indignation. You march into this house, ruin a $200 bottle of champagne, and disrespect your brother-in-law after everything he has done for your family. I slowly turned to face her, the cold clarity still anchored firmly in my chest. What he has done for my family, Mom is subject my husband to dangerous working conditions and publicly humiliate him for sport. I am not going to sit here and let him be treated like a stray dog begging for scraps. My father stood up next, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He pointed a thick finger at Ethan, who was still sitting quietly, trying to process the rapid escalation. Look at him, Naomi. He could not even hold on to his corporate job. He has dragged you into a mountain of medical debt. Jamal tossed him a lifeline, and you are throwing it back in his face because of your own petty pride. It is not pride, Dad, I fired back, my voice rising to meet his. It is basic human decency. They are treating him like garbage. You are acting like a petulant child, my mother shrieked, stepping around the table until she was practically in my face. You have always been like this. You cannot stand to see Vanessa succeed. You cannot stand that she built a multi-million-dollar company while you are stuck answering phones. So you have to create drama to ruin her big week. I will not allow it. I stared at the woman who brought me into this world, feeling absolutely nothing. The emotional detachment was complete. They had chosen their side. They had chosen the illusion of wealth over the reality of their own daughter's suffering. You will apologize to Jamal right now, my mother demanded, her voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper. You will apologize, and Ethan will be at that warehouse tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. to fulfill his scheduled shift. If you walk out that door tonight, if you sabotage your sister's $25 million buyout with this ridiculous tantrum, you are done. She paused, making sure her next words landed with maximum impact. Do you understand me, Naomi? You will be completely cut out of this family. We will not help you. We will not speak to you. You and your unemployed husband can figure out your own mess. Vanessa crossed her arms, a smug, triumphant smile returning to her face. She leaned against the credenza, clearly enjoying the show. Better listen to her little sister. You really cannot afford to burn this bridge. I looked around the room, taking in their arrogant, expectant faces. They were all waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the old Naomi, the scared, desperate daughter who just wanted her parents' approval to cave in, apologize, and accept the abuse. Instead, I reached down and gently grabbed Ethan's hand. I pulled him up from his chair. He stood tall beside me, his grip firm and steady. He did not say a word, but the look in his eyes told me he was entirely with me no matter the cost. You do not have to cut me out. Mom, I said, my voice eerily calm and devoid of any emotion. I am walking out. I turned my back on them and began walking toward the front door, pulling Ethan along with me. Naomi, my father bellowed, his voice booming through the hallway. If you leave now, do not ever come back. I did not stop. I did not look back. I reached the heavy oak front door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the warm summer night. The humid air felt surprisingly clean after the suffocating toxicity of that dining room. I pulled the door shut behind me, the solid thud echoing with a sense of profound finality. As we walked down the driveway toward my car, Ethan finally spoke, his voice rough but steady. Are you okay? I squeezed his hand. I have never been better. I unlocked the car and we slid inside. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the sprawling suburban house. Through the large front window, I could see my mother pacing furiously while Jamal poured himself another glass of wine, clearly unbothered, assuming they had won. Let them fume. Let them celebrate their imaginary $25 million. Tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, the Summit Global Audit team was going to rip their entire world apart piece by piece. The sun had barely risen over Austin the next morning, but the oppressive heat was already creeping through the cracks of our apartment windows. I was awake sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of black coffee, mentally preparing for the corporate bloodbath that would commence at 8 o'clock. Ethan was up early too, dressing in his plain jeans and a clean cotton shirt. He was not putting on his work boots. He walked into the kitchen and grabbed his keys from the counter. "I am going down to the warehouse to get my personal toolkit," he told me. His voice was steady, but there was a hard edge to it. "I brought my own gear yesterday because their equipment was rusted out. I'm going to grab my things, turn in my employee badge to Human Resources, and officially walk away." I set my coffee mug down, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. "Just let the tools go, Ethan. I do not want you anywhere near Jamal this morning. Things are going to get incredibly ugly there in a few hours." Ethan shook his head. "My grandfather gave me that socket set, Naomi. I am not leaving it there for Jamal to throw in the trash. Besides, I need to hand in my badge and sign the termination paperwork properly. If I just abandon the job, Vanessa will try to claim I stole company property or breached a contract. I want a clean break. I will be in and out in 15 minutes." I reluctantly agreed, kissing him goodbye and telling him to keep his phone on. Ethan arrived at the Apex Logistics compound just before 7. The massive steel gates were open for the early freight deliveries, and the morning shift was already buzzing with activity. He bypassed the main office and walked straight down the concrete ramp toward the employee locker room, located right off the main loading dock. He just wanted to grab his heavy canvas tool bag, drop his plastic badge on the supervisor's desk, and drive home. But Jamal was already waiting for him. As Ethan swung his locker door shut, he turned to find Jamal blocking the narrow concrete aisle. Jamal was not wearing his typical tailored suit this morning. He was dressed in a tight black polo shirt and slacks, his arms crossed over his chest, his face twisted into an ugly, vindictive sneer. He had been stewing in his own rage all night. I had completely humiliated him in front of my parents, ruined his expensive vintage champagne, and rejected his authority. Jamal was the kind of man who could not let a perceived slight go unpunished. Since he could not reach me, he was going to take it out on the man standing right in front of him. "Look who decided to show up," Jamal mocked, stepping closer to Ethan. "I thought your wife told you that you were too good to work for a living." Ethan did not take the bait. He slung his heavy canvas tool bag over his shoulder and pulled his employee badge from his pocket. He held the plastic card out toward Jamal. "I am just here to get my personal belongings and officially resign. Here is my badge. I will not be returning." Jamal did not take the badge. Instead, he let out a low, menacing laugh that echoed off the metal lockers. "You really think you can just walk into my facility, disrespect my family, and then quietly sneak out the back door? You do not get to quit, Ethan. You are a liability." Ethan pushed past him, aiming for the exit. "We have nothing left to discuss, Jamal." As Ethan stepped out of the locker room and onto the open floor of the loading dock, two large men in dark gray security uniforms stepped out from behind a stack of wooden pallets blocking his path to the parking lot. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his grip tightening on the strap of his tool bag. He looked back at Jamal, who was slowly walking out onto the dock, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. Jamal pointed a finger toward an empty loading bay at the far end of the warehouse. "You see that space right there, Ethan?" That bay was holding a shrink-wrapped pallet of high-end tablet computers scheduled for transit to Dallas. It was worth $15,000, but when I came in this morning to do my inventory check, that pallet was completely gone. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. I spent my entire shift yesterday manually unloading crates in Bay 4. I never even went near that side of the building." "That is a very interesting story," Jamal replied smoothly, his tone dripping with fake concern. "Because according to the floor schedule, you were the last employee assigned to sweep the entire loading dock before closing. And now a very expensive shipment is mysteriously missing right on the same morning you decide to pack up your bags and run away." Ethan felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. This was not just a petty confrontation. Jamal was staging a massive theft and deliberately pinning it on him. This was a calculated frame-up. "Move out of my way," Ethan demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. He took a step forward, but the two security guards immediately stepped closer, resting their hands heavily on their utility belts. Jamal pulled a walkie-talkie from his belt and pressed the button. "Lock the front gates," he ordered the guard booth. "Do not let anyone in or out." He clipped the radio back to his belt and looked at Ethan with pure malice. "You are not going anywhere, thief. We are going to have a nice long chat about how you plan to repay my company." The two security guards moved in immediately, their hands gripping Ethan tightly by his upper arms. Ethan is a highly intelligent man. He knew that throwing a physical punch would instantly turn a fabricated theft accusation into a very real, undeniable assault charge. He relaxed his shoulders and allowed them to escort him away from the loading dock, following Jamal up the metal staircase to the second-floor mezzanine. Jamal pushed open the heavy oak door to his private executive office. The contrast between the sweltering, dangerous warehouse below and this room was absolutely sickening. The air conditioning was blasting, chilling the room to a comfortable 68 degrees. The furniture was sleek, modern leather. Jamal walked around his massive mahogany desk and dropped heavily into his high-backed executive chair. He gestured for the security guards to stand out in the hallway and pull the glass door shut behind them. Once they were alone, Jamal opened his top desk drawer and pulled out a crisp white sheet of paper. He slapped it down onto the polished wood, sliding it across the desk until it stopped right in front of Ethan. "Read it," Jamal commanded, leaning back and steepling his fingers together with an air of absolute superiority. Ethan looked down at the document. The bold heading at the top read, "Confession of Debt and Promissory Note." He quickly scanned the dense legal jargon. The document explicitly stated that Ethan voluntarily admitted to the theft of company property valued at $15,000. It further stated that in exchange for Apex Logistics not pressing criminal charges, Ethan agreed to repay the full amount within 90 days at an exorbitant interest rate. A cold wave of realization hit Ethan. This was not a spur-of-the-moment accusation triggered by their argument in the locker room. Jamal had this document typed, printed, and waiting on his desk before the sun even came up. This was a highly calculated trap designed to enslave him financially and put a permanent leash on our entire family. "You are completely out of your mind," Jamal Ethan said quietly. He did not reach for the paper. "I am not signing a confession for a crime I did not commit." Jamal let out a sharp, condescending sigh, like a disappointed teacher dealing with a slow student. "Let me explain the reality of your situation, Ethan. Right now, I have two security guards standing right outside that door who are perfectly willing to swear they saw you loading a pallet of electronics into an unmarked van last night. I have a missing inventory log. And I have you a disgruntled employee who suddenly tried to quit and flee the premises before the morning inventory check even began." Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his eyes cold and dead. In the state of Texas, stealing $15,000 worth of merchandise is a felony. It is grand larceny. If you do not sign that paper right now, I am picking up this phone and calling the police. They will march you out of here in handcuffs in front of the entire morning shift." Ethan stared back at him, his expression hardening into stone. "You have no proof. The warehouse cameras will show I never went anywhere near that bay." Jamal laughed out loud, a harsh grating sound that echoed off the glass walls. "What cameras? We had a brief power surge last night. The security feeds for that section of the warehouse were unfortunately wiped clean. It is your word against mine, Ethan. And who do you think the police will believe, the wealthy chief operating officer of a multi-million-dollar logistics firm or the desperate broke warehouse worker drowning in hospital bills?" Jamal stood up, pacing slowly behind his desk. "Even if you somehow beat the charges in court months from now, the arrest alone will be on your public record forever." He smiled, showing his perfectly white teeth. "You will never pass a corporate background check again. Your brilliant career as a supply chain manager will be permanently dead. You will be lucky to get a job flipping burgers. Sign the paper, Ethan. Take the debt. It is the only way you walk out of this room without handcuffs." Ethan looked down at the piece of paper. He knew Jamal was absolutely ruthless enough to follow through. A felony arrest would bankrupt us in legal fees alone, even if he was eventually proven innocent. But signing a false confession was career suicide anyway. They wanted to ruin him just to teach me a lesson. Ethan reached into his pocket. Jamal tensed, assuming Ethan was going for a pen. Instead, Ethan pulled out his cell phone. You have 5 seconds to put that phone away before I call dispatch. Jamal warned, his hand hovering over his desk phone. Ethan ignored him. He kept his eyes locked firmly on Jamal as his thumb quickly tapped out a desperate text message to me. I was sitting at my kitchen island when my secondary phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Ethan. The message was short and terrifying. Jamal locked the gates. He is framing me for a missing pallet. Wants me to sign a $15,000 confession. I stared at the screen for exactly 1 second. My blood ran completely cold. This went far beyond the petty corporate bullying from last night. Jamal was crossing the line into criminal extortion. I grabbed my car keys, ran out the door, and practically flew down the stairs of our apartment building. The drive to Apex Logistics usually took 20 minutes in morning traffic. I made it there in 12. When I pulled up to the main entrance, the massive steel security gates were indeed chained shut just as Ethan had said. A lone security guard was standing inside the fence looking nervous. I did not bother rolling down my window to argue with him. I parked directly across the driveway, completely blocking the exit, and marched straight toward the pedestrian side gate. I knew the code from years ago when my parents first bought the facility. The green light flashed, the gate clicked open, and I stormed onto the property. The warehouse floor was unnervingly quiet. Work had ground to a halt. Employees were standing in small clusters, whispering and glancing up toward the glass-enclosed executive office on the mezzanine. They knew something incredibly wrong was happening. I ignored their stares and took the metal stairs 2 at a time. When I reached the second floor, 2 large security guards were standing outside Jamal's door. They stepped forward, crossing their arms to block my path. "You cannot go in there," the taller one said. I did not even break my stride. I looked the man dead in the eye and kept walking forward. "If you touch me, I will have you arrested for assault and named personally in a massive civil lawsuit," I said, my voice cutting through the air like a razor. The guard hesitated for just a fraction of a second, intimidated by my absolute lack of fear. That was all the opening I needed. I pushed past his arm, grabbed the handle, and shoved the heavy oak door wide open. Jamal was sitting behind his mahogany desk, looking incredibly smug. Ethan was standing opposite him, jaw clenched, refusing to look at the document on the table. And standing by the window, to my complete lack of surprise, was my sister Vanessa. She must have arrived shortly after Ethan to witness the execution of their little plan. I stepped into the room and let the door slam shut behind me. "Let him go, Jamal," I demanded, my voice loud and commanding in the small space. "We are leaving right now." Jamal leaned back in his leather chair and let out a loud, theatrical laugh. "Your husband is not going anywhere, Naomi," Jamal said smoothly. "He has some company property to account for, specifically a $15,000 shipment of electronics that vanished during his shift." Ethan moved to stand beside me. "I told you, Naomi, they are trying to frame me," Ethan said quietly. I reached out and squeezed his arm silently, telling him I had this under control. "You are out of your mind if you think you can pull off this ridiculous extortion," I said, glaring at Jamal. "Open those gates or I am calling the authorities myself." Vanessa stepped away from the window, holding her latest model smartphone up in the air, her thumb hovering right over the screen. "Go ahead and try," Vanessa said, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across her face. "I already have the police dialed on my screen. 1 tap and they will be here in 5 minutes to arrest your husband for felony theft. We have witnesses, Naomi. We have the missing inventory logs. He is going to leave this building in handcuffs and his career will be over forever." I looked from my sister to my brother-in-law. The arrogant smirks on their faces made everything blindingly clear. They did not actually care about the missing electronics because nothing was actually missing. They had hidden the pallet themselves. This was not about recovering lost money or even about punishing Ethan for walking away. This was about establishing total, unbreakable dominance. They wanted to saddle us with a massive, fake debt, so we would be financially ruined and completely subservient to them for the rest of our lives. They wanted to own us. I felt a cold, dangerous calm settle over my entire body. They thought they had trapped us in a corner. They did not realize they had just locked themselves in a cage with an apex predator. Before anyone could make another move, the heavy oak door to the office swung open again. My parents, Richard and Patricia, stepped into the room. They were both dressed in their usual country club attire, looking completely out of place in a freight warehouse, but perfectly cast for the theatrical performance they were about to deliver. Vanessa had obviously called them long before Ethan even arrived this morning. This entire confrontation was a carefully orchestrated family ambush. My father shook his head in exaggerated disgust, glaring at Ethan as if he were a violent criminal. "I cannot believe you brought this kind of shame to our family," he muttered, crossing his arms over his chest. "After everything Jamal did to help you." I stepped in front of Ethan, shielding him from my father's gaze. "Stop the act, Dad," I said sharply. "There is no missing pallet and you know it. Why are you really here?" My mother walked past me and stood next to Vanessa. She placed a comforting hand on her golden daughter's shoulder, then looked at me with a perfectly practiced expression of maternal disappointment. "We are here to help you, Naomi. We are here to offer you a way out of this nightmare before Vanessa is forced to involve the authorities." I crossed my arms and waited. I knew exactly what was coming. This was the shakedown. "Jamal is a generous man," my mother continued, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "He is willing to forgive the $15,000 debt. He is willing to overlook the stolen electronics and keep the police out of this. He will let Ethan walk away right now with a clean record, and no one outside this room will ever know what your husband did." "And what is the price for this incredible generosity?" I asked, keeping my tone deadpan. My mother exchanged a quick knowing look with Jamal. "The price is simple," she said. "You need to sign over your 10% share of the family property to Vanessa." The room went completely silent. Suddenly, every single puzzle piece clicked perfectly into place. When my grandfather passed away, he left the bulk of the family trust to my parents, who immediately handed it over to Vanessa to start Apex Logistics. But my grandfather had explicitly carved out a 10% equity share of the actual commercial land the warehouse sat on, and he left that directly to me. For years, my family had treated that 10% as a meaningless technicality, but now they were days away from a $25 million corporate buyout from Summit Global Partners. I knew exactly how corporate acquisitions worked. Summit Global would demand 100% clear title to the property before wiring a single dime. My family could not sell the company without my signature. They needed my 10%, and they needed to steal it from me before I ever found out how much the land was actually worth. They framed my husband for a felony just to extort me out of my inheritance. I looked at Vanessa, who was staring back at me with a triumphant gleam in her eyes. "It is a fair trade, Naomi," she said sweetly. "You give up a useless piece of paper, and your husband avoids federal prison. I already have the property transfer documents drawn up. They are sitting right here on Jamal's desk. Just sign them and you both can go home." I looked down at the documents resting next to the fake confession. Then I looked at my parents, who were nodding in agreement, fully endorsing this criminal blackmail. I reached down and grabbed Ethan by the hand. His grip was tight and solid. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and smiled. "No." My mother blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What did you just say?" I said, "No. I am not signing anything." I pulled out my own cell phone and held it up. "Go ahead and call the police, Vanessa. Let me dial them for you. Let us bring the authorities down here right now. Let them pull the corrupted security feeds. Let them run a full forensic audit on Jamal's inventory logs and see exactly where that pallet went. Let us get everything on the official public record." Vanessa lowered her phone, the triumphant smirk slipping from her face. She exchanged a panicked glance with Jamal. They had absolutely no intention of involving the real police, because a real investigation would expose their fraud immediately. They were banking entirely on my fear. "You are making a massive mistake, Naomi," my father warned, stepping forward to block the door. "You walk out of here and we will destroy him." "Move out of the way, Dad," I commanded. My voice held a level of absolute authority that made him instinctively take a step back. I kept my hand firmly locked with Ethan's and walked him right past my parents, out the heavy oak door and down the metal staircase. Jamal yelled after us, threatening to file the charges by noon, but I did not even look back. As we walked out the pedestrian gate and got into my car, I knew exactly what they were thinking. They thought I was a terrified, powerless woman running away to cry. They assumed the pressure would break me. They had no idea their time was already up. The next morning arrived with the kind of thick, suffocating humidity that promised another brutal Texas day. At 7:55, Jamal was sitting at his mahogany desk, sipping his overpriced espresso. I knew exactly what he was doing because my legal team had already anticipated his next move. He had the fake police report printed out, resting right next to the property transfer documents my family expected me to sign in tears. He was likely waiting until exactly 9 o'clock to call me, ready to deliver his final threat. He thought he was holding all the cards. He thought he was completely untouchable. But at exactly 8 o'clock, before Jamal could even pick up his telephone to execute his blackmail, the crushing reality of corporate America came tearing through his front gates. A fleet of 4 sleek black SUVs with heavily tinted windows turned off the main road and drove straight onto the Apex Logistics property. The warehouse security guard stepped out of his booth, raising a hand to stop them, but the lead vehicle simply flashed a federal compliance badge through the rolled-down window. The heavy gate was opened immediately. The vehicles rolled directly up to the main office entrance, parking in a perfectly synchronized line that entirely blocked Jamal's own luxury sports car. The doors opened simultaneously. 12 men and women dressed in sharp, immaculate business suits stepped out onto the hot asphalt. They did not carry friendly smiles or introductory brochures. They carried heavy aluminum briefcases filled with forensic data extraction hardware. This was the deep dive due diligence team from Summit Global Partners, a group of financial predators whose entire job was to rip companies apart down to their foundation and expose every hidden liability. They marched through the glass front doors of the main office like a highly trained military unit. They completely ignored the panicked protests of the front desk receptionist and bypassed the waiting area entirely. They headed straight for the metal staircase leading up to the executive mezzanine. Up in his office, Jamal heard the commotion. Assuming it was just an unruly delivery driver or a complaining employee, he threw open his heavy oak door, his face twisted in a scowl of pure annoyance. "What is the meaning of this?" he barked, stepping out onto the landing with his chest puffed out to project dominance. "This is a restricted executive area." The lead auditor, a tall, unsmiling corporate bulldog named Harrison, did not even break his stride. He walked straight up the stairs, stopping mere inches from Jamal, completely invading his personal space. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bearing the unmistakable silver crest of Summit Global Partners. Jamal, Chief Operating Officer Harrison, asked, his voice completely devoid of warmth or professional courtesy. Jamal frowned, his arrogance faltering for just a fraction of a second. "Yes. Who are you?" "We are not expecting any visitors today. We are the forensic audit team for Summit Global Partners," Harrison stated loudly, ensuring his voice carried down to the warehouse floor below. "Per Section 4 of your acquisition letter of intent, we are initiating an immediate, unannounced deep dive audit of this facility and all its operating entities." Jamal forced a tight, artificial smile, trying desperately to quickly recover his usual corporate charm. "Ah, the Summit team. Well, you are a few weeks early, but we welcome the oversight. Give me an hour to clear my schedule, and I will have my assistant set up a conference room with our standard financial portfolios." Harrison did not smile back. He did not even blink. "We do not want your standard portfolios," he said coldly. "The $25 million acquisition is officially frozen. We are taking direct control of your servers right now. I need immediate unrestricted access to your physical employee time cards, your off-the-books payroll ledgers, and every single tax filing for the last 5 years." Jamal's artificial smile instantly collapsed. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. "I am sorry, that is highly unusual. Our legal counsel needs to be present for any data extraction." Furthermore, Harrison interrupted his voice, raising another decibel to echo off the corrugated metal roof. I need the complete HVAC maintenance logs for the warehouse floor, the temperature index readings for the past 6 months, and all corresponding occupational safety incident reports. We have reason to believe this facility is operating under severe federal safety violations. If you attempt to deny us access to any room or any file, the buyout will be terminated immediately for breach of fiduciary duty. Jamal stood completely frozen on the metal landing. The espresso cup in his hand shook visibly, rattling against its ceramic saucer. Down on the warehouse floor, the workers had stopped moving, staring up at the man who had tormented them for years. They watched him get publicly humiliated and stripped of his power in real time. His smugness, his untouchable arrogance completely evaporated into the hot morning air. The trap he thought he had set for my husband was absolutely nothing compared to the massive corporate jaws that had just snapped shut around his own neck. Jamal slammed the heavy oak door shut, the solid click of the deadbolt echoing like a gunshot in the suddenly silent executive office. He backed away from the wood, his chest heaving as if he had just sprinted a marathon. Outside the frosted glass of his office walls, he could hear the heavy, methodical footsteps of the Summit Global auditors spreading out across the mezzanine, commanding his employees to step away from their workstations. Vanessa, who had been sitting on the leather sofa scrolling through her phone, dropped her device onto the cushions. Her face drained of all color. "What is happening out there?" she demanded, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are those men?" "It is the Summit audit team," Jamal gasped, rushing past her and lunging for his mahogany desk. "They are demanding everything. The servers, the physical ledgers, the safety logs. They know." Someone tipped them off. Vanessa jumped up, her designer heels clicking frantically across the hardwood floor. "They cannot just walk in here and take our files. Call our lawyers right now. Tell them to block the data extraction." Jamal pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk and began yanking out thick manila folders. "There is no time to call the lawyers, Vanessa. By the time a judge looks at an injunction, those auditors will already have mirrored our entire hard drive. We have to destroy the physical copies of the off-the-books payroll. If they cross-reference the floor schedules with the actual direct deposits, we are going to federal prison for wage theft." Panic, raw and absolute, finally shattered Vanessa's carefully maintained facade. She grabbed a handful of folders from Jamal's trembling hands and rushed over to the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting in the corner of the office. The machine whined to life, its steel teeth tearing through the fraudulent invoices. "But destroying the payroll is not our biggest problem," Jamal muttered, his hands flying across his computer keyboard as he frantically logged into the administrator portal. The lead auditor specifically asked for the HVAC maintenance logs and the temperature index readings. Vanessa's hands stopped hovering over the shredder. "What does the air conditioning have to do with the corporate buyout?" Jamal looked up, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "We disabled the warehouse ventilation systems 3 months ago to cut overhead costs and artificially inflate our quarterly profit margins. We have been forcing the floor staff to do heavy manual lifting in 100-degree heat without mandated safety equipment or cooling breaks. That is a massive OSHA violation. It is a federal crime. If Summit Global reports us to the Department of Labor, the government will seize this entire facility by Friday. We will lose the $25 million. We will lose everything." The shredder hummed in the background, devouring the last of the fake payroll records, but the sound offered no comfort. They both knew that digital footprints were nearly impossible to erase completely. Vanessa sank into one of the leather guest chairs, burying her face in her hands. "We are ruined," she sobbed, the reality of her impending bankruptcy crashing down on her. The yacht, the Hamptons house, the country club, all of it was gone. Jamal's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. His gaze landed on the crisp white sheet of paper resting perfectly in the center of his desk. It was the fake confession of debt he had prepared for Ethan just 1 hour ago. He stared at the blank signature line, and a dark, desperate idea began to take root in his mind. "We are not ruined yet," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He picked up the piece of paper and slowly crumpled it into a ball, tossing it into the trash can. Vanessa looked up, her mascara running down her cheeks. "What are you talking about?" They are outside our door right now. They know the violations happened. Jamal explained, his fingers moving rapidly back to his keyboard. We cannot hide the fact that the heat was turned off or that the time cards were altered. But the auditors do not know who actually authorized it. They just see the data. If we want to survive this, we cannot deny the crimes. We have to give them a scapegoat, a rogue employee. Vanessa's eyes widened as she slowly understood his plan. You want to blame a floor worker who would have the system access to pull that off? Jamal clicked open the security access logs on his monitor. Ethan, he said coldly. Your sister just dragged him out of here, Vanessa protested. He quit. He was only here for 1 day. Exactly. Jamal countered, his fingers flying across the keys as he began manually altering the administrative permissions in the system backend. Ethan is a highly trained supply chain manager. He knows exactly how warehouse management software works. I am going to backdate his user profile and assign him as the interim safety supervisor for the past 3 months. I will alter the digital logs to make it look like Ethan unilaterally shut down the HVAC systems to cover up his own theft of the electronics. I will say he doctored the time cards to hide his tracks. Jamal hit the enter key, saving the forged digital records deep into the server just seconds before the summit auditors remotely locked him out of the system. He leaned back in his chair, a sickeningly smug smile returning to his face. We just give the auditors Ethan. We throw him to the federal prosecutor's claim we were victims of a disgruntled manager, and the buyout proceeds as planned. I sat at my expansive mahogany desk on the 42nd floor of the Summit Global Partners Tower. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the downtown Austin skyline, but my focus was entirely on the monitors in front of me. My office was the quiet, untouchable nerve center of the Mergers and Acquisitions division. Vanessa, of course, believed I was sitting in a cramped cubicle somewhere in the basement, answering phones and fetching coffee for middle management. I was busy reviewing the preliminary data extraction reports my audit team had just securely transmitted from the Apex logistics servers when my personal cell phone suddenly buzzed against the polished wood. The caller ID flashed my sister's name. I stared at the screen, letting it ring 3 times before making a move. I reached out and pressed a specific button on my desk console, instantly routing the incoming audio through my secured corporate recording system. Every single word of this conversation would be legally preserved and admissible. I cleared my throat deliberately, dropping my posture and softening my voice to perfectly mimic the helpless, intimidated younger sister they had so eagerly bullied just 24 hours ago. Hello, I answered hesitantly. Naomi? Oh, thank God you picked up. Vanessa was openly sobbing into the receiver. The sound was incredibly theatrical, a sharp contrast to the vicious woman who had threatened to permanently destroy my husband's career last night. Please, you have to help us. We are in terrible trouble. What is wrong? I asked, injecting just the right amount of nervous panic into my tone to keep her talking. These corporate auditors from your company just stormed into our building. They locked Jamal out of the servers, and they are demanding all our files. They are trying to ruin the buyout, Naomi. They are trying to steal the $25 million from our family. You have to help me right now. I do not understand, Vanessa. What can I possibly do from here? I just work in the administrative pool. I do not have any power at this company. But you have access, Vanessa pleaded, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. You walk past their desks all day. You know the assistants who work for the audit managers. You can easily sneak a peek at their files when they go to lunch. Just look at the Apex folder, Naomi. I just need to know exactly what they are looking at and what they copied. That is strictly against company policy, Vanessa. I could lose my job if they catch me snooping around confidential acquisition files. Ethan just lost his job this morning. We absolutely cannot afford for me to be fired right now. Forget about your stupid receptionist job, Vanessa snapped. The mask of the grieving, desperate sister slipped for a split second before she forced the fake tears back into her voice. Naomi, please listen to me. If the buyout goes through, I will personally give you $100,000. I promise you. You will never have to answer a phone again. Just tell me what the auditors found. I took a slow, deep breath, leaning back comfortably in my plush executive chair. What exactly are you afraid they will find? I asked softly. If the company is clean, the audit is just a formality. There was a heavy, agonizing pause on the other end. I could practically hear the gears turning as she weighed the massive risk of trusting me against her absolute desperation. Look, Jamal cut some corners. Okay, she finally whispered. He had to do it. The freight industry is brutal right now. We had to make the profit margins look much better for the summit executives to approve the sale. Cut corners how I pressed, keeping my voice entirely innocent. Like skipping routine truck maintenance. No, nothing like that. It is the payroll. Vanessa let out a frustrated sigh, completely oblivious to the fact that she was actively confessing to a federal crime on a recorded line. We had a lot of off-the-books laborers working the loading dock this summer. We paid them strictly in cash envelopes, so we did not have to report the massive overtime hours or pay the mandatory payroll taxes. It saved us hundreds of thousands of dollars. But Jamal kept a secondary ledger tracking those exact cash distributions in his desk drawer. I shredded the physical copies this morning, but I need to know if the auditors found the digital backups on the hidden server drive. If they see those cash payments, they will know we committed tax fraud. The admission was so perfectly clear, so undeniably damning, that I almost smiled. She had just handed me the final nail for her own coffin. Tax fraud, wage theft, off-the-books labor. It was all securely captured on my corporate hard drive. Okay, I whispered, sounding appropriately terrified. I will see what I can find out during my lunch break. I swear on my life, Naomi, thank you. You are saving this family. I pressed the end call button on my console and immediately exported the audio file to a secure, encrypted flash drive. Vanessa had just handed me the smoking gun, completely unaware that her helpless little sister was the executioner preparing the gallows. I leaned back in my chair, taking a moment to process the sheer audacity of her confession when my private corporate line lit up again. This time, the caller ID displayed a number from inside the Apex Logistics warehouse. It was Harrison, the lead auditor I had dispatched that morning. I picked up the receiver. Status report, Harrison. We have secured the physical premises and mirrored their primary servers. Harrison replied, his voice a low professional murmur over the chaotic background noise of the warehouse floor. But we have a major development on the compliance end. The chief operating officer just handed over the HVAC maintenance logs and the digital time cards. Let me guess, I said, staring out at the Austin skyline. He doctored them. He did more than doctor them, Naomi. Harrison paused, the rustle of heavy paper audible through the phone. He just submitted a formally signed and notarized affidavit to our team. He is officially claiming that the federal safety violations were the result of a rogue employee acting entirely without executive authorization. He provided system access logs showing this individual unilaterally deactivated the warehouse ventilation systems to bypass the security cameras, allegedly to cover up the theft of high-value inventory. I felt my pulse steady into a slow, rhythmic beat. And who exactly did Jamal name as this rogue employee? Harrison read directly from the document. A recently terminated interim safety supervisor named Ethan. He backdated an employment contract and forged a signature. The ink is practically still wet. The metadata on the server files shows the digital permissions were altered exactly 14 minutes ago, but Jamal is insisting these are the original records. He is offering up this man as the sole scapegoat for every single compliance violation we uncovered today. The air in my office suddenly felt incredibly thin. I closed my eyes as the absolute gravity of Jamal's actions washed over me. This was no longer just a cruel family dynamic or a petty attempt to extort money. My sister and her husband were actively conspiring to send my husband to federal prison. The charges Jamal was fabricating, grand larceny, tampering with safety equipment, and federal OSHA violations, carried mandatory minimum sentences. They were perfectly willing to lock an innocent man in a cage for years, destroying his life and completely breaking our family, just to ensure their $25 million payday went through without a hitch. They were not just greedy, they were monsters. "Are you still there?" Naomi Harrison asked, breaking the heavy silence. "Should I have my compliance attorneys notify the authorities about the forgery? We have the digital footprint proving he altered the server while we were standing right outside his office. We can have him arrested for obstruction right now. No, I answered quickly, my eyes snapping open. Do not call the authorities yet. If you arrest him now, the deal collapses quietly, and they spend the next 5 years tying us up in civil litigation playing the victims. I want this destruction to be absolute and undeniable. What are your orders? Harrison asked, his tone shifting into complete professional alignment. Accept the documents I commanded. Pretend you believe every single word of his ridiculous story. Tell Jamal that Summit Global appreciates his transparency, and that given this new evidence of a rogue employee, the acquisition process will proceed exactly as planned. Tell him the final contract signing is still scheduled for this Friday in our penthouse boardroom. Harrison chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound. You are going to let them walk right into the boardroom. I want them to feel like they have won, Harrison. I want them to put on their designer suits, walk into our corporate headquarters, and reach out for that $25 million check. Bag and tag every single forged document Jamal just handed you. Cross-reference his fake logs with the real server backups. Prepare the penalty clauses for a massive breach of the letter of intent. We are not just going to deny them the buyout. We are going to financially gut them. Understood, Senior Vice President Harrison replied formally. We will clear out of the warehouse by noon and let them think they survived the storm. I hung up the phone and looked down at the encrypted flash drive resting on my desk. Jamal thought he was a criminal mastermind because he knew how to alter a database. He had absolutely no idea he had just committed federal perjury directly to a corporate entity that had the power to crush him like an insect. I had everything I needed. The trap was fully set. All I had to do now was wait for Friday morning. That evening, the humid Texas air finally broke, giving way to a violent summer thunderstorm. Thunder rattled the windows of my second-floor apartment, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside. Ethan and I were sitting in the living room going over our remaining finances. He had no idea about the massive corporate machine I had just unleashed on his behalf. I needed to keep him completely insulated from my actions so he would never be implicated in any retaliation. A sharp, demanding knock on the front door shattered the quiet of the apartment. Ethan frowned, looking at his watch. It was past 9 o'clock. Are you expecting anyone? No, I said, setting my pen down. Stay here. I will get it. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. My stomach immediately clenched. Standing in the hallway, looking completely soaked and frantic, were my parents. They never visited my apartment. In fact, they had openly mocked the neighborhood when Ethan and I first moved in. For them to show up here unannounced in the middle of a thunderstorm meant Vanessa had completely panicked and called in the cavalry. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches. What do you want? I asked, keeping my tone guarded and entirely devoid of warmth. My mother pushed against the door, her desperation giving her surprising strength. Let us in, Naomi. We need to talk to you right now. It is an absolute emergency. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped back, allowing them to enter. They stood in my small entryway, dripping rainwater onto the cheap laminate flooring. My father looked pale, his usual arrogance completely replaced by a tense, nervous energy. My mother was wringing her hands together, a clear sign of deep agitation. Ethan stood up from the couch, his posture instantly defensive. What are you two doing here? He asked sharply. My father held up a hand, attempting a placating gesture. We are not here to fight Ethan. We are here as a family. We have to solve a massive problem together. I crossed my arms. Stop talking in circles, Dad. Tell me exactly why you are standing in my apartment. My mother took a deep breath, her eyes darting between Ethan and me. The Summit Global auditors found something at the warehouse today. Something very bad. Jamal and Vanessa are facing severe compliance issues. If they do not resolve this immediately, the entire $25 million buyout will be canceled. Our family will lose everything. I kept my face perfectly blank. And what exactly does that have to do with us? Ethan quit this morning. We are officially done with Apex Logistics. My father took a step forward, his voice dropping to a low, pleading register. It has everything to do with you, Naomi. The auditors need someone to take responsibility for the violations. Jamal already submitted the paperwork to them. He told them Ethan was the acting safety supervisor. Ethan froze, the color draining from his face. He did what? My mother rushed forward, reaching out to grab Ethan's arm, but he violently stepped back. Please, Ethan, you have to listen to me, she begged, her voice rising in panic. Jamal is a vital executive. He is the face of that company. If the federal authorities look at him, the deal dies. But you are just a floor worker. You are nobody to those corporate lawyers. I stared at her, completely stunned by the sheer brutality of her words. You did not just come here to tell us. Jamal framed him. I said, my voice barely a whisper. You came here to ask him to take the fall. It is the only way, my mother cried out, turning her desperate gaze to me. Think about the family, Naomi. If Ethan just admits he made a mistake, if he just takes the blame for shutting down the warehouse systems, the company gets sold. Yes, he might face some legal trouble, maybe a few months in a minimum security facility, but Vanessa is willing to compensate him generously. She reached into her soaked designer handbag and pulled out a thick envelope. She practically shoved it toward my chest. Vanessa will give him $50,000 under the table, completely tax-free. It will pay off all your medical debt. Just take one for the team, Naomi. For the family. I looked down at the envelope in her shaking hand. $50,000. That was the price they had placed on my husband's freedom, his reputation, and his future. They wanted to send him to federal prison so they could collect $25 million, and they actually expected me to force him to do it. Ethan was completely speechless, staring at my parents as if they were alien creatures. The absolute moral bankruptcy standing in my living room was suffocating. They had crossed a line so vile, so completely irredeemable, that any lingering shred of familial obligation I felt instantly turned to ash. I did not scream. I did not cry. The sheer audacity of their request pushed me past the point of anger into a state of absolute icy calm. I took a slow step back from my mother, putting distance between us. I needed everything on the record. My apartment was equipped with a high-end motion-activated security camera, sitting right on the bookshelf, completely disguised as a digital clock. It captured both crisp video and flawless audio of the entire living room. I casually reached out and tapped the top of the device, manually engaging the continuous recording function. The tiny red indicator light blinked to life, completely unnoticed by my parents. Let me make sure I understand this perfectly, I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady, ensuring every word was clearly picked up by the microphone. You are asking my husband to falsely confess to federal safety violations and grand larceny, knowing full well he is completely innocent, just so Vanessa and Jamal can secure their $25 million payout. My mother let out a frustrated sigh, wiping the rainwater from her forehead. Do not make it sound so dramatic, Naomi. It is just business. Jamal is the one who built that company. Did you know what he was doing? I interrupted, my voice sharpening like a blade. Did you know he shut down the warehouse ventilation in the middle of a Texas summer and paid the floor staff off the books to hide the labor hours? My father scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest in a posture of complete arrogance. He took the bait immediately. Of course we knew, Naomi. We sit on the advisory board of Apex Logistics. That is how the freight industry operates. You have to cut corners to stay competitive. It is smart business. Jamal was optimizing the profit margins to ensure Summit Global would approve the final valuation. He did what he had to do to secure the family legacy. And Ethan is just acceptable collateral damage. Ethan finally spoke up, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of rage and disbelief. You actually expected me to go to federal prison for your smart business decisions. My father turned to Ethan, his expression completely devoid of empathy. You have contributed absolutely nothing to this family, Ethan. You lost your job. You drowned my daughter in medical bills. You owe us. Jamal gave you an opportunity and you walked away. The least you can do is take responsibility for this one small compliance issue so the real executives can move forward. $50,000 is more money than you have seen in a year. I felt a sickening twist in my stomach, not from surprise, but from the absolute confirmation of their depravity. They had just confessed on tape to having full, prior knowledge of the federal crimes committed at Apex Logistics. Not only did they know, but they actively endorsed it as an advisory board. They were just as legally culpable as Jamal and Vanessa. I looked at my mother. And you agree with this? You want Ethan to take the fall for Jamal? My mother nodded eagerly, entirely misinterpreting my calm demeanor as compliance. Yes, Naomi. Please, we just need you to convince him to sign the confession Jamal drafted. Once the audit clears, we will all take a family vacation to celebrate. Everything will go back to normal. I let out a slow, dark laugh. It was a cold, humorless sound that echoed off the walls of the small apartment. Normal. You want everything to go back to normal. I walked over to the front door and pulled it wide open. The sound of the thunderstorm immediately filled the room, the rain lashing aggressively against the concrete walkway outside. Get out, I commanded. My voice was low, but it carried an undeniable weight of finality. My mother blinked, her eager expression faltering. Naomi, please, we are not leaving until we have an agreement. I am not negotiating with you, I said, pointing a rigid finger out into the storm. You are not my family. You are completely morally bankrupt. You just admitted to conspiring to commit federal fraud and attempting to bribe an innocent man into perjury. You have used me and abused me for 34 years, and I am officially done. Get out of my home right now. My father took an aggressive step forward, his face flushing dark red. You ungrateful little brat! If you do not help us fix this, I swear I will make sure you both pay for ruining your sister's life. Ethan immediately stepped between us, his posture radiating a dangerous protective energy. You heard her, Richard. Get out before I throw you out. My father glared at Ethan, weighing his chances against a man half his age before finally backing down. He grabbed my mother's arm and forcefully pulled her toward the door. You are dead to us, Naomi. He spat viciously as they crossed the threshold. I slammed the heavy door shut, twisting the deadbolt with a satisfying click. The emotional ties were officially severed. I turned back to Ethan, who was staring at the closed door, still trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. I walked over and gently touched his arm. They are dead to us too, Ethan, I said softly. But they are about to find out exactly who they just threatened. I glanced over at the digital clock on the bookshelf. The red light was still blinking. I had the confession. The execution was scheduled for Friday. Wednesday morning arrived with a heavy, oppressive silence following the storm. I was sitting in my office at Summit Global reviewing the final valuation adjustments for the Apex Logistics acquisition when my desk phone rang. It was the head of building security down in the main lobby. He informed me that a courier was insisting on delivering a certified legal document to me personally. Assuming my family still believed I was a low-level administrative assistant, I took the private elevator down to the ground floor, intercepted the courier near the receptionist desk, and signed for the thick manila envelope. I carried the package back up to the 42nd floor, locked my office door, and sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. Inside was a stack of legal documents printed on the heavy textured paper favored by law firms trying to project authority. I glanced at the letterhead and immediately recognized the firm. Jamal had not hired a prestigious corporate attorney. He had hired a sleazy, bottom-feeding litigator famous in Austin for sending aggressive, baseless threat letters to intimidate people who could not afford legal representation. The first document was a formal cease and desist order. The language was overly dramatic and packed with legal jargon designed to terrorize a layman. It formally accused me of defamation slander and tortious interference with a business contract. The lawyer claimed that my petty jealousy over my sister's success had led me to spread malicious lies about the operational integrity of Apex Logistics. It demanded that I immediately retract all statements regarding Jamal's business practices and cease all contact with any party related to the Summit Global acquisition. If I refused, the letter threatened a massive civil lawsuit that would bankrupt me and garnish my wages for the rest of my life. But Jamal did not stop at hollow civil threats. He wanted to ensure I was completely paralyzed by fear. Behind the cease and desist letter was a secondary document that made my eyes narrow. It was a certified copy of an official police report. Jamal had actually done it. After my parents failed to secure Ethan's false confession the night before, Jamal panicked and pulled the trigger. He had formally filed charges with the Austin Police Department, officially naming my husband as the sole suspect in the grand larceny of a $15,000 electronics shipment. He had included a sworn affidavit stating Ethan was a disgruntled employee who had tampered with the warehouse security cameras to cover his tracks. Jamal thought this was his masterstroke. He assumed that receiving an official police report would completely break my resolve. He pictured me sitting at a tiny cubicle desk, crying, terrified that the police were going to kick down my apartment door at any moment and drag my husband away in handcuffs. He expected me to pick up the phone, beg for his mercy, and sign over my grandfather's property just to make the nightmare end. I did not shed a single tear. I did not flinch. I felt an overwhelming sense of cold satisfaction. Jamal had just escalated his lie from a private family dispute to a documented sworn criminal offense. Filing a false police report is a crime. Submitting a perjured affidavit in relation to a corporate merger is a severe federal violation. He had meticulously documented his own criminal conspiracy and delivered it straight to my desk via certified mail. I sat down in my plush executive chair, smoothed out the crisp legal pages on my mahogany desk, and activated my high-speed document scanner. I scanned every single page of the cease and desist letter and the fraudulent police report, converting them into high-resolution digital files. Next, I opened a secure encrypted email draft directed to the senior partners of Summit Global's federal compliance legal team. These were not the cheap, loudmouth lawyers Jamal hired. These were elite corporate assassins who dismantled billion-dollar frauds for a living. I attached the scans of Jamal's legal threats. Then I attached the forged OSHA documents and doctored safety logs that Harrison had secured from the warehouse the day before. Finally, I attached the pristine audio recording of Vanessa confessing to the off-the-books payroll fraud, along with the video of my parents admitting their complicity. I typed a short, precise message to the legal team. The target has officially filed fraudulent criminal charges to conceal their compliance violations. All evidence of perjury and extortion is attached. Finalize the breach of contract penalty clauses. Prepare the absolute maximum financial damages allowed under the letter of intent. We execute the termination on Friday morning in the boardroom. I hit send, watching the progress bar briefly flash across my screen before confirming the transmission. The trap was now fully armed, locked, and completely inescapable. Jamal thought he was using the law to crush me, but he had just handed me the exact legal ammunition I needed to obliterate his entire existence. Friday morning arrived with brilliant clear blue skies over downtown Austin. The gleaming glass and steel skyscraper of Summit Global Partners towered over the city center, a monolithic symbol of absolute corporate power. At exactly 9:45, a stretched black limousine pulled up to the front curb. The driver hurried around to open the door, and out stepped the apex of unearned arrogance. My family had arrived to claim their $25 million prize. Jamal emerged first, adjusting the cuffs of a custom-tailored midnight blue suit that easily cost $5,000. He wore a heavy gold watch on his wrist, a visual declaration of his anticipated wealth. Vanessa stepped out next, wearing a crimson designer dress and oversized sunglasses, carrying a luxury handbag that screamed nouveau riche. My parents followed closely behind Richard in a crisp summer suit, and Patricia draped in expensive silk. They looked less like business executives arriving for a corporate acquisition, and more like lottery winners arriving to collect an oversized check. They walked through the massive revolving glass doors and stepped into the sprawling white marble lobby of the Summit Global headquarters. The space was intimidatingly quiet, filled with serious professionals moving briskly with briefcases and tablets. But my family completely ignored the established decorum. They treated the corporate lobby like their own private VIP lounge. Vanessa immediately pulled out her smartphone and threw her arm around Jamal. She held the camera high, capturing the gleaming Summit Global logo carved into the marble wall behind them. "Smile for the new yacht, baby," she chirped loudly, her voice echoing sharply across the cavernous room. Several executives walking past turned to look at them with expressions of mild distaste, but Vanessa simply smiled wider, reveling in the attention. She snapped half a dozen selfies, instantly uploading them to her social media accounts to broadcast her imaginary victory to the world. My mother clasped her hands together, practically vibrating with excitement. "I still cannot believe this day is finally here," she said, her voice carrying easily to the nearby reception desk. $25 million. It feels like a dream." Jamal chuckled a deep, self-satisfied sound. "It is not a dream, Patricia. It is the result of brilliant strategic management. We built an empire, and now we are cashing out at the absolute peak of the market." My father patted Jamal heavily on the shoulder, beaming with pride. "You certainly navigated that little hiccup with the auditors brilliantly, son. I knew those federal compliance lawyers were all bark and no bite. You gave them exactly what they wanted to hear, and they folded immediately." Vanessa let out a sharp, mocking laugh as they began walking toward the main security desk. "Honestly, I am just glad we are finally done with Naomi and her deadbeat husband. Can you imagine the absolute nerve of Ethan trying to ruin this deal for us? Jamal framing him was the smartest business move this family has ever made. By Monday morning, that loser will be dealing with a criminal defense attorney, and we will be drinking champagne in the Hamptons. Let Naomi enjoy her pathetic life answering phones in the basement." They approached the massive curved mahogany reception desk. Jamal leaned against the polished wood, flashing his brightest, most charismatic smile at the receptionist. "Jamal and Vanessa, Chief Operating Officer and Chief Executive Officer of Apex Logistics," he announced loudly. "We are here for the 10 o'clock signing ceremony in the executive boardroom. Our lawyers should already be waiting upstairs." The receptionist, a sharply dressed woman who had been fully briefed on the morning's protocols, did not return his smile. She simply tapped her keyboard, printed out 4 temporary visitor badges, and slid them across the counter. "You are expected on the 42nd floor penthouse," she stated with cold professionalism. "Security will escort you to the private executive elevator." A tall man in a dark suit stepped forward from the lobby, gesturing toward a set of frosted glass elevator doors reserved exclusively for senior partners. My family eagerly followed him, their excitement reaching a fever pitch. The elevator ride was swift and silent, rocketing them toward the top of the skyscraper. When the doors finally slid open, they stepped out onto the penthouse floor. The space was breathtaking. The floors were polished slate. At the end of the long hallway stood the executive boardroom. It was a massive glass-walled corner room, offering a panoramic view of the Austin skyline. A massive oak conference table sat in the center. Vanessa gasped, taking in the sheer luxury. "This is it," she whispered reverently. "We made it." They walked through the open glass doors and took their seats, completely unaware that they had just walked willingly into their own execution chamber. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom slid shut behind them, sealing the room. The space was dominated by a massive, polished oak conference table that seemed to stretch on forever. At the far end of the table sat the executive leadership of Summit Global Partners. The CEO, a sharp-featured man named Marcus Thorne, sat at the center, flanked by 3 senior compliance attorneys. They were not smiling. They were not engaged in friendly pre-meeting banter. They sat with the cold, predatory stillness of a firing squad, waiting for the order to execute. My family, however, was completely oblivious to the freezing temperature of the room. They strutted to the opposite end of the long table, the leather chairs squeaking slightly as they took their seats. Jamal immediately unbuttoned his suit jacket, leaning back with an air of total ownership. He tossed a thick leather portfolio onto the table, a prop designed to make him look prepared. "Good morning, gentlemen," Jamal said smoothly, turning on his practiced corporate charm. "It is an absolute pleasure to finally sit down and formalize this partnership. Apex Logistics is thrilled to join the Summit Global family." Marcus Thorne did not return the greeting. He simply clasped his hands together on the oak table and looked at Jamal with an expression of mild anthropological interest, as if observing a fascinating but ultimately doomed insect. "We are not quite ready to formalize anything, Mr. Jamal," Marcus said, his voice deep and entirely devoid of warmth. "We are waiting on one final arrival." Jamal frowned slightly, his perfectly cultivated smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "I was under the impression that the term sheet was finalized and all necessary parties were present. Is there an issue with the compliance review?" One of the senior attorneys, a woman with graying hair and a severely tailored suit, pushed a thick stack of manila folders toward the center of the table. "The compliance review was completed yesterday afternoon following your helpful submission of the updated safety logs and employee affidavits." Jamal relaxed visibly, a smug grin returning to his face. "Ah, yes. The rogue employee situation. It was a regrettable oversight, but as you can see from our documentation, we acted swiftly to isolate the problem. We believe in total transparency at Apex Logistics." The gray-haired attorney did not blink. "Indeed. We are very interested in your version of transparency." Vanessa leaned over to my mother, completely misreading the tension in the room. She lowered her voice to a loud whisper that easily carried across the polished table. "As soon as the wire transfer hits, I am calling that broker about the 70-foot Sunseeker. We can have it docked in Miami by the end of the month." My mother patted Vanessa's hand affectionately. "You deserve it, sweetheart. You have worked so hard for this." My father, eager to assert his own relevance, leaned forward and cleared his throat. "As advisory board members, Patricia and I are fully prepared to sign over our remaining equity shares today. We want to ensure a smooth transition for Summit Global." Marcus Thorne slowly shifted his gaze from Jamal to my father, his eyes cold and unreadable. "That is very generous of you, Richard. However, the equity transfer is the least of our concerns this morning." Jamal sat forward, resting his elbows on the table, trying to regain control of the room. "If the compliance review is cleared and the equity is ready to transfer, then who exactly are we waiting for? I have a celebratory lunch scheduled at 1 o'clock, and I would prefer to keep to my itinerary." Marcus Thorne leaned back in his chair, a very faint, almost imperceptible smirk touching the corners of his mouth. "You will have to adjust your itinerary, Jamal. As CEO, I oversee the broad strokes of our acquisitions. But the final decision, the absolute authority to sign the $25 million check or terminate the agreement, entirely rests with the executive who personally oversaw the forensic audit of your facility." Jamal smoothed his silk tie, his confidence remaining completely unshaken. He had charmed countless executives before. He fully believed he could charm this one. "I look forward to meeting him. I am sure we will see eye to eye on the immense value Apex Logistics brings to this portfolio." Marcus Thorne glanced at his luxury wristwatch. "You will not be meeting a him, Jamal. Our senior vice president of mergers and acquisitions is a she, and she is extremely thorough." At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom clicked open. The sound was sharp and definitive, echoing across the polished slate floor. The final arrival had stepped into the room. The heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open silently. Two towering corporate attorneys dressed in immaculate dark gray suits stepped into the room first. They moved with absolute precision, taking up positions on either side of the entrance, like guards securing a perimeter. A heavy silence fell over the long table. Every eye in the room turned toward the doorway. Then I stepped over the threshold. I was not wearing the cheap off-the-rack blouses I wore to family dinners. I was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal gray power suit that commanded immediate authority. My hair was pulled back into a sleek style, projecting the absolute confidence of a woman who held their financial fate entirely in her hands. I walked with purpose, the sharp click of my designer heels echoing off the polished slate floor, breaking the suffocating silence. My family completely froze, staring at me, as if an apparition had just floated into the boardroom. They could not reconcile this powerful woman with the helpless younger sister they had bullied days prior. My mother broke the silence with a high-pitched, incredibly nervous laugh that bounced awkwardly off the glass walls. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Naomi, what on earth are you doing in here?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of embarrassment and rising panic. "Did they send the receptionist up to pour the coffee? You should not be interrupting an executive meeting like this." My father aggressively cleared his throat, flushing dark red with immediate anger. He began to stand up, pointing a reprimanding finger in my direction. "Get out of here right now, Naomi," he hissed, trying to keep his voice low. "Have you completely lost your mind? We are in the middle of a $25 million negotiation. You are going to get yourself fired." I did not stop walking. I did not acknowledge their frantic commands. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the head of the table. I reached the end of the massive oak conference table and took my place standing directly beside the chief executive officer. The two attorneys who escorted me moved silently to stand right behind my chair, framing me in absolute corporate power. Jamal was staring at me, his arrogant smile completely wiped away. His eyes darted nervously between me, the chief executive, and the senior compliance attorneys. The gears in his head were grinding frantically, trying to figure out why the administrative assistant was surrounded by high-powered lawyers. The chief executive stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked down the length of the table at my family, his expression perfectly composed and utterly lethal. "Richard, Patricia, I believe you are laboring under a massive misconception regarding the corporate structure of this firm," he said, his deep voice carrying absolute authority. He turned to me, extending a hand in profound professional respect. "Allow me to formally introduce the executive you have been waiting for. This is Naomi. She is not a receptionist. She is the Senior Vice President of Mergers and Acquisitions for Summit Global Partners. She personally oversees our entire logistics portfolio, and she is the sole executive who orchestrated the forensic audit of your warehouse yesterday morning." The reaction was instantaneous. The color completely drained from Jamal's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw physically dropped. He gripped the edge of the oak table so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He realized the woman whose husband he had maliciously framed for a felony was the exact same woman holding the absolute power to destroy his $25 million payday. Vanessa gasped loudly, pressing both of her hands over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. The luxury yachts, the Hamptons vacation homes, the country club memberships, she watched all of it instantly vaporize right in front of her eyes. She was looking at the executioner she had personally created. My parents sat completely paralyzed. My father's pointing finger slowly lowered to the table. The sheer magnitude of their miscalculation was crashing down on them. They had spent 34 years treating me like absolute garbage, banking everything on Vanessa and Jamal. And now they were sitting in my boardroom on my turf, entirely at my mercy. I looked down the length of the table, making direct eye contact with every single one of them. I let the crushing weight of the silence stretch out for several agonizing seconds, allowing them to fully absorb their new reality. "Good morning, family," I said softly. I placed my leather portfolio onto the table and took my seat at the head of the board. "Shall we discuss your audit?" I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of impending destruction. I unclasped the silver latch on my leather portfolio and slowly opened it. The quiet rustle of paper was the only sound in the penthouse boardroom. I withdrew the first document and slid it precisely down the center of the oak table until it rested right in front of Jamal. It was the forged OSHA safety log he had handed to my audit team the day before. "This," I began, my voice perfectly level, "is the sworn affidavit you submitted to Summit Global Partners yesterday morning. In it, you claim that Ethan was the acting safety supervisor who unilaterally deactivated the warehouse ventilation systems. You also claim he altered the digital time cards to cover his tracks." Jamal swallowed hard, his eyes locked on the document. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin another lie, but the words died in his throat. I pulled a second document from my portfolio and laid it next to the first. "This is the metadata extraction from your primary server captured by my forensic team before you locked them out. It definitively proves that the system permissions were altered exactly 14 minutes prior to you handing the affidavit to my lead auditor. You forged this document, Jamal. You committed federal perjury in an attempt to defraud a corporate entity." Jamal's hands began to shake. He looked wildly around the room, desperate for a lifeline. "This is absurd," he stammered, his voice cracking. "This is a personal vendetta. She is trying to sabotage the deal because she is jealous." Marcus Thorne. The CEO folded his hands on the table. We do not operate on personal vendettas, Jamal. We operate on evidence. Continue, Naomi. I reached into my portfolio again, this time pulling out a small, sleek audio recorder. I placed it on the table and pressed play. Vanessa's frantic, tearful voice instantly filled the boardroom. We had a lot of off-the-books laborers working the loading dock this summer. We paid them strictly in cash envelopes, so we did not have to report the massive overtime hours or pay the mandatory payroll taxes. Vanessa let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her face as her own voice condemned her. Jamal kept a secondary ledger tracking those exact cash distributions in his desk drawer. The recording continued. If they see those cash payments, they will know we committed tax fraud. I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was suffocating. Tax fraud and wage theft. I stated clearly, looking directly at my sister. An explicit admission voluntarily provided. We have already matched the cash distributions to the bank withdrawal records my team pulled yesterday. The evidence is irrefutable. My father, finally grasping the absolute devastation of the situation, tried to salvage whatever he could. Naomi, please? He begged, his voice trembling. They made a mistake. We can fix this. We can lower the valuation. We can restructure the deal. There is no deal to restructure, Richard. I replied coldly, intentionally, using his first name to sever any remaining illusion of family. I pulled out the final piece of evidence. It was the certified copy of the police report Jamal had filed against Ethan. You did not just make a mistake, I said, my voice finally dropping into a low, dangerous register. You conspired to send an innocent man to federal prison to protect your payout. You fabricated a grand larceny charge to extort me out of my inheritance. Jamal suddenly pushed his chair back violently. He stood up, his face twisted in a mask of pure, desperate rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me. You cannot do this, he screamed, the polished facade completely shattered. You cannot just take everything from us. Sit down immediately. One of the senior compliance attorneys ordered, his voice booming with absolute authority. Do not take another step forward or security will physically remove you from this building. Jamal froze, his chest heaving before slowly sinking back into his chair, utterly defeated. I picked up the final document in my portfolio. It was the fully executed term sheet, the $25 million contract they had come to sign. The document that represented their yachts, their vacation homes, their entire fabricated empire. I held it up so they could all see the Summit Global seal at the top. I looked directly into Vanessa's terrified eyes. This is what you thought Ethan's freedom was worth, I said softly. Then with slow, deliberate precision, I gripped the top edge of the thick contract and tore it straight down the middle. The sound of ripping paper echoed sharply in the silent room. I placed the two torn halves neatly back into my portfolio and closed it. The acquisition is officially terminated. I announced, the finality of the words hanging heavy in the air. We are done here. The tearing of the contract hung in the air, a sound that signified the absolute end of their $25 million fantasy. Jamal stared blankly at the spot on the table where the document had just been, his mind unable to process the magnitude of the loss. But I was not finished. Destroying their payday was only the first half of my mandate. The second half was ensuring they paid for the damage they had attempted to inflict. I turned to Marcus Thorne. He gave a brief approving nod. I reached into my leather portfolio one final time and extracted a single crisp sheet of paper. It was not a contract. It was an invoice. I slid it deliberately across the polished oak, stopping it right next to the forged safety logs. While the acquisition is terminated, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute corporate detachment, your financial obligations to Summit Global Partners are not. When you signed the initial letter of intent 3 months ago, you agreed to standard penalty clauses regarding the due diligence process. Specifically, Section 8 explicitly states that if the target company is found to be operating in bad faith or deliberately provides fraudulent financial and operational data, they are completely liable for all costs incurred by our firm. Jamal slowly shifted his gaze from the empty space on the table to the new document. His eyes were completely glassy. You deployed a massive forensic audit team to our warehouse. Jamal mumbled, his voice sounding hollow and distant. Exactly, I replied. We deployed 12 senior auditors, forensic accountants, and federal compliance attorneys. We utilized significant corporate resources based entirely on the fraudulent premise you established. You wasted our time, and you attempted to use our corporate infrastructure to cover up your own federal crimes. Therefore, I am officially invoking the breach of contract penalty. I tapped my manicured finger against the bottom line of the invoice. You owe Summit Global Partners $1.5 million in due diligence penalty fees. This amount is payable in full within exactly 30 days. If the funds are not wired by the deadline, we will place a corporate lien on your commercial property and force the immediate liquidation of Apex Logistics. The number echoed in the boardroom like a death sentence. $1.5 million. Jamal did not have that kind of liquidity. He had spent the last 3 months heavily over-leveraging the company to artificially boost operations, assuming the massive buyout would cover his tracks. He was instantly, undeniably bankrupt, and the financial ruin was only the beginning. With the federal evidence sitting right in front of him, he knew the Department of Labor and the Internal Revenue Service would be the next ones knocking on his door. He was going to federal prison. The realization hit him so hard, he physically slumped forward, his face bearing into his hands, a defeated, broken man. Next to him, my father began to hyperventilate. Richard gripped the edge of the heavy oak table, his knuckles turning white as he gasped for air. He was having a near panic attack. He had secretly put up his own sprawling suburban home as collateral to secure the bridge loans Jamal needed to keep the warehouse running this summer. With Apex Logistics bankrupt and Jamal facing prison, the bank would immediately call in the debt. Naomi, you cannot do this. My father wheezed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. We will lose the house. We will lose everything we have worked for. Please, you are my daughter. I looked at the man who had threatened to destroy my husband just 2 nights ago. You told me it was smart business, Richard, I said coldly. This is just smart business. That was the breaking point for Vanessa. The reality that her yacht, her designer clothes, and her entire manufactured identity were completely gone. Finally snapped her fragile grip on reality. She shot up from her chair so violently that the heavy leather seat crashed backward onto the polished slate floor. You are a monster, Vanessa screamed at the top of her lungs, her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. You planned this, you jealous, vindictive monster. You are destroying your own family because you could never be me. She lunged forward, her hands reaching out across the table as if she wanted to physically attack me. I did not even blink. I sat perfectly still. Before Vanessa could take another step, the 2 towering corporate attorneys standing behind me signaled the room. The heavy oak doors flew open. 4 massive security guards in dark suits rushed into the penthouse boardroom. They grabbed Vanessa by the arms instantly, locking her in a rigid, unbreakable hold. Get your hands off me! She shrieked, kicking her designer heels wildly against the floor. I am the chief executive officer. I will sue all of you. The guards ignored her frantic screaming. They physically lifted her off the ground and dragged her backward through the glass doors. Her hysterical screams echoed down the long, immaculate hallway of the 42nd floor, growing fainter and fainter until the elevator doors finally clamped shut. Inside the boardroom, only the sound of my father sobbing and Jamal staring blankly into his own destruction remained. Exactly 1 week later, the final domino fell. The swift and brutal machinery of the federal government descended upon the Apex Logistics warehouse. It happened on a Tuesday morning right around the time Jamal usually enjoyed his overpriced espresso. A fleet of unmarked white vans and local police cruisers blockaded the main entrance. Agents from the Department of Labor, accompanied by federal tax investigators, stormed the facility. They did not knock. They padlocked the heavy steel gates, ordered every single employee to vacate the premises, and began systematically seizing servers, file cabinets, and physical assets. By noon, the entire company was officially frozen under a federal injunction. Apex Logistics was dead, and Jamal was sitting in a police precinct waiting for a high-priced defense attorney he could no longer afford. I watched the news break on the financial monitors in my corner office. There was a brief, sterile headline on a local news channel about a Texas freight company under federal investigation for severe wage theft and safety violations. I took a sip of my black coffee, feeling an incredible sense of peace. The storm I had summoned had finally washed the rot away. That afternoon, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against my mahogany desk. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I had ignored her calls for the past 7 days, letting her stew in the immediate aftermath of the boardroom massacre. But today, with the federal raid officially on the public record, I decided to answer. I pressed the green button and put the phone on speaker, leaning back in my executive chair. Patricia did not even wait for me to say hello. She was sobbing a deep, guttural sound of pure panic that I had never heard from her before. The perfectly manicured country club matriarch was completely gone, replaced by a terrified woman watching her entire life evaporate. "Naomi, please, you have to help us," she gasped, her voice cracking under the weight of her hysteria. "You have to stop this. They are taking everything from us." I kept my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of the sympathy she was desperately hunting for. "Who is taking everything, Patricia?" "The bank," she cried, blowing her nose loudly into the receiver. "Two men in dark suits came to the front door this morning. They served us with foreclosure papers right on our front porch in front of the neighbors. We have 30 days to vacate the house, Naomi. 30 days. They are taking the house, they are taking your father's retirement accounts. They are taking everything." "Why is the bank taking your house?" I asked. I already knew the financial mechanics behind her ruin, but I wanted to hear her say it out loud. I wanted her to admit the absolute foolishness of her blind loyalty to Jamal and Vanessa. "Your father," she stammered, choking on her own tears. "Your father believed in Jamal so much. Jamal needed cash to keep the warehouse running smoothly before the Summit Global buyout. He said it was just a temporary bridge loan to cover the off-the-books payroll and pad the profit margins. So your father secretly put up our house as collateral. He signed a personal guarantee for a massive commercial loan. We thought we would pay it back the second the $25 million wire transfer hit our account. We thought it was a guaranteed investment. But the wire transfer never came. Instead, the $1.5 million penalty fee I had slapped on Apex Logistics triggered an immediate default on all of Jamal's existing credit lines. The bank panicked. They froze Jamal's accounts, and when they realized his company was a hollow shell under federal investigation, they instantly moved to seize my parents' property to recoup their massive losses. My parents had gambled the roof over their heads on a criminal enterprise, and the house always wins. "You are a senior vice president," my mother pleaded, her voice dropping into a pathetic begging whine. "You make incredible money, Naomi. You have access to corporate funds. Please. You cannot let your own parents end up on the street. It is $400,000 to clear the immediate debt. You can pay off the bank. You can save our home. I am begging you on my hands and knees. We will do anything. We will apologize to Ethan. We will never speak to Vanessa again. Just write the check and save us." I listened to her beg. I listened to the woman who had demanded my husband go to federal prison for $50,000, now demand I hand over almost $500,000 to save her from her own greed. The sheer audacity was almost poetic. She actually believed that blood meant I was obligated to rescue her from the fire she had happily tried to push me into. I let the silence hang over the phone line for a long moment. I stood up from my mahogany desk and walked out onto the private balcony attached to my new corner office. The promotion to senior vice president had come with several perks, but the view of the Austin skyline from the 42nd floor was easily the best one. I looked down at the tiny cars crawling along the city streets, feeling a profound sense of distance from the desperate woman crying into my phone. "Family loyalty," I repeated slowly, letting the words roll around in my mouth. "You are actually asking me for family loyalty right now." "Yes," my mother wept, completely missing the dark irony in my voice. "We are your family, Naomi. We need you." "You told me Ethan was a nobody," I said, my voice dropping the facade of politeness and turning instantly to ice. "I remember your exact words, Patricia. You stood in my living room and told me my husband was a nobody and Jamal was a vital executive. You demanded that we sacrifice our entire future so you could cash a $25 million check. You were perfectly willing to let Ethan rot in a federal prison to protect a man who was actively committing corporate fraud. My mother gasped, stammering defensively. We made a mistake, Naomi. We were desperate. We did not know the whole truth. You knew exactly what he was doing, I countered sharply, recalling the video recording safely locked in my corporate vault. You told me it was smart business. You chose your golden child and her fraudulent husband over me, just like you have done every single day of my life. You built an entire empire on lies and exploitation, and now you want me to write a $400,000 check to save you from the consequences of your own greed. Naomi, please do not do this, my mother pleaded, her voice rising in a fresh wave of panic. We will be homeless. Where will we go? What will we do? I leaned against the glass railing of the balcony. That is not my problem, Patricia. I suggest you ask your vital executive to help you. Although considering his current legal situation, I doubt his bank accounts are very liquid right now. You are a monster, she spat, her desperation finally curdling into the familiar bitter hatred she always reserved for me. You are just like your sister said. You are a cold, vindictive monster. I smiled, though she could not see it. No, I am just the market correcting itself, and it looks like the market vehemently disagreed with your valuation of my husband. I did not wait for her to scream another insult. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting off the connection instantly. I opened my phone settings and navigated to my contact list. I tapped my mother's name, selected the block caller option, and confirmed. Then I did the same for my father. Finally, I navigated to Vanessa's number and blocked her as well. The digital severance was immediate and absolute. They could never call me, text me, or reach my voicemail again. The toxic tether that had bound me to that family for 34 years was finally completely severed. I slipped the phone back into the pocket of my blazer and took a deep breath of the warm Texas air. The weight I had carried since childhood, the constant suffocating need for their approval, the endless anxiety of never being good enough, it was entirely gone. I felt incredibly light. I was financially independent, professionally powerful, and emotionally untouchable. I turned away from the sweeping city view and walked back into my corner office. The large mahogany desk was clear save for a single pristine folder resting precisely in the center. It was an employment contract. As a senior vice president, I had the authority to restructure the logistics division of Summit Global Partners. Following the catastrophic failure of the Apex Logistics acquisition, our board of directors recognized a critical need for superior supply chain management. They needed someone who could build a massive ethical distribution network from the ground up, someone who understood the actual mechanics of the freight industry without resorting to federal crimes. I had personally submitted a candidate for the new Director of National Logistics position. The board reviewed his resume, conducted a thorough background check, and unanimously approved the hire. I picked up my phone and dialed Ethan's number. He answered on the second ring. Hey, he said, his voice warm and steady. Hey, I replied, sitting back down in my plush leather chair. I need you to put on your best suit and come down to the Summit Global headquarters this afternoon. We have a contract for you to sign. Ethan arrived at the Summit Global headquarters exactly 45 minutes later. He stepped out of the elevator on the 42nd floor wearing the dark charcoal suit he had saved for special occasions. He looked incredibly handsome, but I could see the confusion in his eyes as he walked down the expansive polished slate hallway. The receptionist, the exact same woman who had coldly directed my family to their corporate execution a week prior, greeted Ethan with a warm, genuine smile and personally escorted him to my door. He walked into my corner office and stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the sweeping panoramic view of the Austin skyline, the expensive leather furniture, and finally the engraved gold nameplate resting on my massive mahogany desk. Senior Vice President of Mergers and Acquisitions. He stared at me, completely speechless. I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my suit, and walked around the desk to meet him. I know this is a lot to process, I said softly, taking his hands in mine. I have a lot to explain about what I actually do for a living, but first we have some business to take care of. I guided him over to the leather guest chairs and handed him the thick, unblemished corporate folder I had prepared. Ethan opened it slowly. Inside was a formal employment contract printed on heavy watermarked paper. When I ordered the forensic audit of Apex Logistics last week, my team did not just find evidence of federal crimes and tax fraud, I explained, returning to my seat. They also found the original operational blueprints you drafted when Jamal first hired you to consult, years ago, the same blueprints he stole and presented to his board as his own. Our auditors dug deep into your professional history. They saw your brilliant track record at your previous firm. They realized you were not the rogue employee Jamal tried to frame, but rather the operational genius he was desperately trying to bury. Ethan looked down at the contract, his eyes scanning the bold text at the top of the page. Director of National Logistics. Summit Global is expanding our freight division across the entire southern region. I continued leaning forward. The board of directors needs someone who actually understands the mechanics of the supply chain industry, someone who can build an ethical, highly profitable network from the ground up, without resorting to wage theft or safety violations. They reviewed your profile and authorized me to make you an immediate offer. Ethan ran his fingers over the salary figure listed on the second page. It was a base compensation package that tripled what he was making before his previous company went bankrupt, complete with a massive signing bonus and premium top-tier executive health insurance that would completely wipe out our remaining medical debt by the end of the month. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with a mixture of absolute disbelief and overwhelming relief. "Naomi?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Is this real?" "It is entirely real," I promised him. "You earned this, Ethan. You survived the worst they could throw at you, and your talent spoke for itself. Sign the paper." He picked up the silver pen resting on my desk and signed his name at the bottom of the contract. The stroke of his pen was firm and decisive. With that single signature, the nightmare of the past few months was officially permanently over. The suffocating weight of debt, the constant fear of medical bills, and the endless crushing humiliation inflicted by my family were entirely erased. Later that evening, long after the rest of the executive floor had emptied out, Ethan and I stepped out onto the private balcony attached to my office. The oppressive Texas heat had finally broken, leaving behind a cool, gentle evening breeze. The sun was setting over the city, casting a brilliant array of purple and gold across the skyline. I handed Ethan a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne, a stark, beautiful contrast to the glass Jamal had ruined at that miserable family dinner. Ethan wrapped his free arm around my waist, pulling me close. He looked out over the glowing city lights, a man completely restored to his rightful place. "To us," he said, quietly raising his glass. "To us," I echoed. We clinked our glasses together, the clear, bright chime ringing out into the evening air. We did not win by screaming in a dining room. We did not win by throwing tantrums or engaging in their petty, toxic games. We won with silent strategy and absolute corporate leverage. We let their own arrogance and greed build the trap, and then we simply locked the door. Have you ever had a family member try to destroy your life only to hand you the exact weapon you needed to ruin theirs? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, the best revenge is not just living well, it is owning the company they try to sell. The story of Naomi, Ethan, Vanessa, and Jamal serves as a powerful illustration of the adage that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 16:18. The central lesson woven throughout this narrative is the devastating consequence of arrogance and the profound danger of underestimating others based on superficial metrics of success. Vanessa and Jamal built their entire identity and self-worth on external markers of wealth, designer clothes, luxury vehicles, and a multi-million-dollar corporate buyout. In their minds, this financial success granted them the authority to mistreat those they deemed less successful, specifically Ethan and Naomi. They confused their bank accounts with their character, believing that because they held the purse strings, they held all the power. They were so blinded by their own hubris that they couldn't conceive of a reality where the receptionist and the warehouse worker could possibly outmaneuver them. This arrogance led them to commit egregious errors in judgment. They didn't just bully Ethan, they actively conspired to ruin his life through criminal extortion, believing their status made them untouchable by the law or basic morality. They assumed their wealth acted as a shield against consequences. However, true power, as Naomi demonstrated, does not lie in loud boasting or cruel displays of dominance. It lies in quiet competence, strategic patience, and the unwavering possession of the truth. Naomi's ultimate victory wasn't just a financial reversal, it was the total dismantling of a false reality built on arrogance and exploitation. The story reminds us that treating people with cruelty and disdain, regardless of their perceived station in life, is not a demonstration of power, but a revelation of profound weakness and insecurity. Always treat everyone you meet with genuine respect, because you never know when the person you overlook today might be the one holding the keys to your future tomorrow.